Jefferson was slightly prone to self-pity. He would often say the burdens of office were too great, the appreciation of his efforts was insufficient, the bitterness of politics was too foul. He would constantly say, I'd much rather be back on my farm in Monticello. He would now have said, in order to spend more time with my family, and we would be able to add, now from what we know, more time with his two families. But as it happens, he could easily have elected to do something other than politics and have been perhaps not as well known, but equally successful in the chosen field. He could have been an excellent lawyer. He was a very good lawyer. It took some quite early cases also about emancipation. He could have been an extremely good librarian. His private library became the core of what is now the Library of Congress in Washington. He designed a plow, which dug a deeper furrow in the soil. He could have been and was a very good farmer. He wouldn't have been a very good wine grower. He never got Virginia wines up to snuff. In fact, they still rather lag, though I think they're better than the Connecticut Chardonnay. When he had to settle a minor point in a question about the rights of whaling, whalers in the Moby Dick sense, between his country, our country, and others, he decided he'd have to write a special treatise on it to study the whole matter properly before he gave his report. He was a genuine polymath. And the city of Philadelphia in that time, while it might not have been the equivalent of, say, 5th century Athens, had become a magnet city for that kind of talent, scientific, medical, philosophical, and so forth. Obviously, the best known to us of this pantheon is Benjamin Franklin, who has a reasonable claim to have discovered at least the workings of electricity and its connection to lightning. But, for example, when Joseph Priestley, who we can, I think, rightly call the discoverer of oxygen, even though he believed in the phlogiston theory for most of his life, was a brilliant scientist, and after his laboratory in Birmingham in England had been smashed, broken up by a mob shouting for the church and the king. These are the supporters of Edmund Burke. Not all of them were as polite or as polished as Mr. Burke was. Mr. Priestley decided to take his remaining instruments and his knowledge and to cross the Atlantic and bring them to Philadelphia, where he knew he'd be welcome. There one could have met people like Dr. Benjamin Rush, a very distinguished physician, also one of the founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Thomas Paine came across there with a letter, indeed, of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, not just in order to exert his fantastic skills as a polemicist and public speaker, but also in the hope of designing what had never been tried before, an iron bridge, a bridge that would span water and connect distant places and survive the winter, wouldn't crack and splinter as wood would do. Bridge building couldn't be a better definition of an Enlightenment project. Bridges are dialectical by definition. They don't go only one way. An ideal occupation for Mr. Paine. Jefferson was absolutely in his element in this world. And I think there are two achievements that we can attribute to this Enlightenment atmosphere, to the sort of authors and writers who they discussed in France and Italy. Cesare Beccaria, for example, whose book on crimes and punishments had begun to revolutionize thinking in Europe. What up until then, executions and torture of the most barbaric kind had been very commonplace. When Jefferson became governor of the state of Virginia, he produced an almost model statute on crime and punishment. Didn't actually succeed in abolishing the death penalty, I'm sorry to say, but in attempting a less retributive and more rehabilitating, more humane and more scientific penal system. That would be one, what I would call Enlightenment achievement, and one that set a precedent across the United States. But the most important one, I believe, and probably the major subject of conversation in Philadelphia at that time, was this, or is this. Once people had begun to realize that the world was not flat, that the sun did not revolve around it, that diseases were not caused by devils or by sin, and various other quite striking disclosures of the kind, they began also to think, as it were inevitably, that, well, there might be another explanation than creation for the way the world was. And though there might be a designer, deism was very common among this group, people who believed, in effect, that the order of nature showed there must have been a god, or at least a starter. but it didn't look as if this person or force took any direct interest in human affairs, did not intervene, did not answer or listen to prayers, was uninfluenced by sect or anything as backward as that it was probably necessary to have a separation in society and in government between the church and the state. No other government before or since has ever deliberated on this point and resolved it in this way. An extremely revolutionary idea at the time. Probably the fact that the British Crown had had its own private church, the Anglican Church, sometimes called the Church of England or the Episcopal Church, which obviously was going to be disestablished in America. The Crown wasn't going to have its own church anymore. May have made it easier. But it was proposed, I'm talking again now about the deliberations in the Virginia Assembly, by Patrick Henry and others, will let us instead have the government support not one church but all churches. Everyone should be tithed for the support of all churches. There was to that proposition in the context only one reply, which was that the government should support no church. And together, Mr. Jefferson and his close lifelong friend, Mr. Madison, evolved the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. How many people here have been to Charlottesville, to Monticello, to see the house? Oh, that's excellent. Well, then you know that but just for those who are watching us, and wishing they were as knowledgeable as we were, those of you at home, ladies and gentlemen, may not know that when Mr. Jefferson designed his own memorial, which takes no religious form, by the way, there's no cross or anything like that on it, he didn't have an attending priest at his deathbed either, which was long foreseen. He only mentions a very small number of achievements. He thought he only should be remembered as founder of the University of Virginia, author of the Declaration of Independence, and author of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. I didn't think it worth mentioning that he'd been president twice, and vice president, and secretary of state, and ambassador to France, or minister to France. So we can well see the salience that he put on this. And because he was in France, he wasn't present at the deliberations in Philadelphia that resulted in the Constitutional Convention. I think it's obvious when you look at it that the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom is the embryo of the First Amendment to the Constitution, which is, in my opinion, the amendment that it outranks, if you like, all the others, which makes a clear separation between church and state, guarantees religious freedom by the only means by which it can be guaranteed, which is to say a secular state, and also guarantees the right of free expression and free assembly. The extraordinary luck of having somebody who could, out of that intellectual ferment of Philadelphia, take it into politics and then into the law and then into a drafting committee and finally into our Constitution is something that I think would be, well, certainly has in fact made a book in itself.